back to History Class with Dr. W. In the series of lectures to follow, we're going to be looking at the period that followed the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, a time when the nation wrestled with many difficult and pressing questions. Political questions like how are we going to bring back the states of the former Confederacy, and what is that relationship going to look like? And social and cultural questions, most pointedly, what was to be done with the freed slaves? How would they be incorporated into society? How would they be protected, cared for, and participate? In this preliminary lecture, we're going to look at some of the earliest efforts at the politics of Reconstruction in a period known as Presidential Reconstruction. In the weeks leading up to Easter Sunday, 1873, Republicans in the small town of Colfax, Louisiana, felt as if they were under siege by the Democrats. Tensions between the two parties, which had been simmering for years, were now beginning to boil over. As those tensions broke out into violence, one Republican was beheaded. One had the unfortunate experience of reading his own obituary just a few days before he was killed as well. As Easter Sunday approached, Republicans received a warning from Democrats. You have 30 minutes to say goodbye to your families. The Republican men did indeed say goodbye to their families and then gathered in the town courthouse. They were there surrounded by a mob of Democrats who set fire to the building. As the Republicans panicked and some tried to run to freedom, they were shot on their way out of the courthouse. Others died in the blaze. All told, 60 men were killed. You might wonder whether this was constitutional. Is it legal? Could they actually do this? Well, in fact, 98 men were indicted for that crime, and 3 were ultimately convicted. But the course made its way all the way through the courts, up to the Supreme Court, which made a surprising ruling in 1876 in a case called U.S. versus Cruikshank. In that ruling, the Supreme Court decided that the 14th Amendment applied only to the states and not individuals. In other words, because the individuals in that mob of Democrats were not acting on orders or under the authority of the state, they had not infringed on the 14th Amendment rights of the people they had murdered. Their convictions were overturned. The Colfax Massacre is only one of the most notorious incidents symbolizing the end of Reconstruction. This was a violent takeover. Some historians actually call the end of Reconstruction the end of the Civil War, and this time the South wins. It is a process by which Democrats retake control of their territory by force. The Cruikshank decision also indicates the lack of interest from the North at that time, the federal government growing tired of the process of Reconstruction that had lasted for almost 10 years leading up to that point. So in this lecture and the lectures to follow, we're going to talk about how we get to that point, the years after the Civil War and up to the end of Reconstruction in episodes like the Colfax Massacre. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the process of presidential Reconstruction and the figures of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. The writer Mark Twain described the Reconstruction period this way. It was a period that uprooted institutions that were centuries old, changed the politics of a people, transformed the social life of half of the country, wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations. This is indeed a critical period in our nation's history, bridging the Civil War era with the 20th century. So first of all, if you're not familiar with Reconstruction itself as an idea, consider the picture that you're looking at on the screen and the physical destruction left in the aftermath of the Civil War, and particularly Sherman's March to the Sea that we discussed in previous lectures. Whole towns, whole cities were left in ruins. Infrastructure like railroad tracks, roads, and bridges were destroyed. In some cases, there were Union soldiers remaining in the South, wreaking havoc. Many Confederate soldiers were returning home, crippled, perhaps badly injured, and unable to make a living. Nobody had any money. And then there were the millions of slaves which were soon to be free, and what was going to happen to them. So this process of Reconstruction is one dealing both with literal kind of physical rebuilding and reconstruction, but also with more of a metaphorical kind of sense of rebuilding. How are we going to bring the nation back together? And what is going to happen culturally? So as we talk about some of the politics of Reconstruction, it's important to note that no one really knew exactly how this process was supposed to work. We haven't had to deal with such an extensive process of Reconstruction before. Congress, of course, makes the laws in the country, but who's in charge of Reconstruction? Well, understanding that no one really knew how this was supposed to work, the first person to deal with it extensively was the president during the war, Abraham Lincoln. And we've already talked about the Emancipation Proclamation and why that was such a significant act, not just during the war, but pointing towards the aftermath. Some might say that the Emancipation Proclamation was a Reconstruction act because it suggests when the war is over, when we win the war, the slaves will be freed. But Abraham Lincoln planned for the actual Reconstruction after the war almost from as soon as the war started. And I mentioned in the previous lecture that in his second inaugural address, he talked about the process of Reconstruction in that famous speech and the idea with malice towards none. That is, we really just need to bring this nation back together. I'll read a little bit more of that speech. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who should have borne the battle and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. With that in mind, he proposed a lenient plan for Reconstruction, known as the 10% Plan. And under this plan, Southern states could begin the process of rejoining the Union if 10% of their voting population took an oath of loyalty to the Union. Those new constitutions also were required to abolish slavery, of course, and then the state could be welcomed back into the Union. Many in the North thought the 10% plan was far too lenient. Only 10% of the population had to take a loyalty oath? What are we fighting for, after all? And so some Northerners made other proposals, notably Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Henry Davis of Maryland, who in July 1864 proposed the Wade-Davis Bill, which would have required a majority of white males to take an ironclad oath to support the U.S. Constitution, suggesting that they had never supported the Confederacy, even during the war. Now this really takes us to the other extreme. The Wade-Davis Bill was never going to be realistic. As it happened, neither of these plans was fully implemented because, as we know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. And so he was not going to be the one to oversee Reconstruction. We can only envision the lenient plan that he had in mind. It's also worth noting one more time that in the aftermath of Lincoln's death, it was the 13th Amendment, passed in December 1865, that ultimately abolished slavery. And though his Emancipation Proclamation was certainly a big step in that direction, it did not formally abolish the institution of slavery. That was the 13th Amendment. The process of presidential Reconstruction was picked up by Lincoln's successor, his Vice President Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency after Lincoln's assassination. Johnson is a complicated and difficult figure to grapple with for historians, but he is widely regarded as one of the worst and least effective presidents in our nation's history. Some consider him at the very bottom, the worst. Johnson grew up poor, a slaveholder from Tennessee, but raised as an apprenticed tailor, which would come into play in some of his nicknames later on down the road. He was a hard worker, but he resented the white gentry, the wealthy slaveholders. And so many mistook that sort of venom against the Southern upper class for sympathy to blacks. After he became president, though, it became abundantly clear that was not the case. Johnson was a virulent racist and a believer in white supremacy. He also just had some venom for wealthy Southerners who had caused him trouble when he was growing up relatively poor. So Johnson, after becoming president, proposed his plan for Reconstruction, which was also lenient on the South, but for different reasons. Some scholars have called Johnson's plan Reconstruction Confederate style. He was lenient to the South because he was a Southerner and favored the South. There were some exceptions to this. He called for a general pardon of Southerners for their actions in the Confederacy, except for those who had more than $20,000 worth of taxable property, so the very wealthy that he resented. But for those wealthy Southerners, they had to appeal to Andrew Johnson personally for a pardon. And yet even that, which sounded somewhat restrictive, turned out to be pretty lenient. After meeting with a few of these wealthy Southerners, Johnson had to hire an assistant, Colonel M.F. Pleasants, who would hear the appeals from those wealthy Southerners. It was said that Colonel Pleasants developed a sore arm from stamping so many pardons. In other words, the process became very quick and easy. Johnson also required an oath to support the Union, and under his plan, voting requirements were a matter for the states to decide. Now, when we think about the former slaves, which we're going to be talking about extensively, if you leave voting up to the states, obviously most southern states are not going to grant those rights to the freed slaves. Southern states also were required to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, in order to be admitted. Now, while there is some uncertainty as to who is in charge and how this process should work, a number of southern states begin moving forward under Andrew Johnson's plan, and so we start to have debates and discussions about what those states needed to do to be readmitted to the Union. We'll discuss that process more in the following lecture.